Hey there, Verified Fears horror family. Tonight we're heading up to Canada's Yukon Territory, where the cold isn't the only thing that'll chill you to the bone. We've got 11 incredible accounts from this frozen wilderness that'll have you questioning everything you thought you knew about what's possible in our world. From mysterious disappearances on ice roads to encounters with things that shouldn't exist in abandoned mining towns. These stories come from one of the most isolated places on Earth. The Yukon's vast emptiness and brutal conditions create the perfect backdrop for experiences that will stay with you long after the video ends. So grab your favorite blanket, turn off the lights, and let's dive into these chilling encounters together. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for every single one of these. Some of them will seriously mess with your head. Ready to explore the dark side of Canada's last frontier? Let's get started. The GPS died exactly when the blizzard hit, and that's when I realized the road I'd been following for 3 hours didn't exist on any map. In 40° weather, with fuel running low and no cell service, I was about to discover why locals call this stretch of the Dempster Highway the Boneyard. What would you do if you found yourself completely lost in a blizzard with your car's fuel gauge hovering near empty and the outside temperature deadly enough to kill you in minutes? Drop your survival strategy in the comments below. I'm curious to see how many of you would have made the same mistakes I did that night. I should have listened to the warning signs from the moment I left Dawson City that February morning in 2019. But I was stubborn and convinced I could make the drive to Inuvik before the weather turned. The fuel attendant at the last gas station had looked at my Vancouver license plates and shaken his head, muttering something about city folks who don't understand northern weather. But I'd brushed off his concern with typical southern arrogance. My GPS showed a clear route north on the Dempster Highway, and the weather forecast had called for light snow, nothing I couldn't handle in my all-wheel drive SUV. What the forecast hadn't mentioned was the sudden temperature drop that would accompany the storm front moving in from Alaska, or the way whiteout conditions could transform familiar landmarks into an alien landscape where every direction looked identical. I'd been driving for about 6 hours when the first snowflakes began to fall. Innocent enough at first, but quickly intensifying into something more serious. The highway markers became harder to read through the increasing snowfall, and I found myself leaning forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up with the accumulation. That's when I made my first critical mistake. Instead of pulling over to wait out the storm, I decided to push forward, confident that I could outrun the weather to the next community. The GPS kept recalculating my route, the estimated arrival time jumping around erratically as satellite signals weakened. But I trusted the blue line on the screen more than my own growing unease. By the time visibility dropped to less than 10 meters, I was committed to a path I couldn't reverse, following what I believed was the highway, but was actually a mining access road that branched off the main route somewhere near Eagle Plains. The blizzard hit with the sudden ferocity that only Arctic storms possess, transforming day into night and turning my SUV into a small bubble of warmth surrounded by a howling white void. Wind speeds that must have exceeded 80 kilometers per hour rocked the vehicle, and snow began accumulating on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, despite the defroster running at maximum. My fuel gauge, which had been sitting at just over a quarter tank, suddenly became the most important display on my dashboard. Each kilometer driven was now measured not in distance, but in precious minutes of heat and life. The GPS signal finally disappeared completely around the same time my cell phone lost its last bar of service, leaving me truly isolated in a landscape where making the wrong decision meant certain death. I stopped the vehicle and tried to assess my situation rationally. But the psychological impact of being completely cut off from civilization in such hostile conditions was overwhelming. The temperature outside had dropped to 42°, according to my dashboard display, cold enough to cause frostbite in exposed skin within minutes and hypothermia in less than an hour for anyone not properly dressed. My winter jacket and boots were adequate for city winters, but laughably insufficient for survival in the Yukon backcountry. And I began to understand why the gas station attendant had looked so concerned. The fuel gauge now read just over an eighth of a tank, enough to keep the engine running for maybe 2 hours if I was conservative with the heat, but not nearly enough to wait out a storm that could last for days. I tried restarting the GPS multiple times, hoping to re-establish satellite connection, but the device remained stubbornly blank except for an error message about signal acquisition failure. Outside, the wind created an almost hypnotic white noise that seemed to muffle even my own thoughts. And I found myself fighting the urge to simply sit still and wait for rescue that I knew wouldn't come. No one knew my exact route. I'd told friends in Vancouver that I was driving to Inuvik, but hadn't specified my departure time or planned stops, and my disappearance might not even be noticed for several days. The reality of my situation began to sink in with crystalline clarity. I was going to die in this vehicle unless I took action. But any action I took could just as easily kill me faster than staying put. I turned off the engine to conserve fuel and immediately felt the cold begin to seep through the vehicle's insulation, a reminder that my temporary shelter was entirely dependent on burning gasoline to maintain the temperature difference that kept me alive. The silence after shutting off the engine was profound and terrifying. Without the familiar hum of the heater and engine, I could hear the full fury of the storm outside. Wind that sounded like the breathing of some enormous beast surrounding my small metal refuge. I tried to think clearly about my options. Stay with the vehicle and hope the storm passed before my fuel ran out. Or attempt to walk back in the direction I'd come from and hope to find the main highway before succumbing to exposure. Both choices seemed like different forms of suicide, but staying put at least gave me some protection from the wind and a few hours of heat to think of alternatives. I turned the engine back on after 20 minutes, partly to warm up, but mostly because the psychological comfort of the heater and lights was worth the fuel cost. Being cold and scared was manageable, but being cold, scared, and sitting in complete darkness felt like accepting death. The fuel gauge needle seemed to move visibly downward as I watched it, each minute of engine operation bringing me closer to the moment when the warmth would stop forever. That's when I noticed the footprints in my headlight beams, human tracks in the snow that definitely hadn't been there when I'd stopped, leading away from my vehicle toward what I assumed was the direction I'd come from. The prints were fresh, barely filled with blowing snow, which meant someone had passed by my location within the last few minutes despite the impossible visibility conditions. I honked the horn repeatedly, hoping to signal whoever had made the tracks. But the sound seemed to be swallowed immediately by the storm without any response. The logical part of my brain insisted that the prints must have been my own from when I'd briefly gotten out to check my surroundings, but I had no memory of walking in that direction, and the boot treads didn't match my own footwear. Following the mysterious tracks seemed insane. Leaving the relative safety of my vehicle in these conditions was almost certainly fatal. But the alternative was slowly freezing to death as my fuel supply dwindled to nothing. I made the decision that probably saved my life, but nearly cost my sanity. I bundled up in every piece of clothing I had, grabbed a small flashlight from my glove compartment, and started following the footprints into the storm. The cold hit me like a physical blow the moment I stepped outside. Wind-driven snow stinging my face and immediately beginning to work its way through every gap in my inadequate clothing. But the tracks were clearly visible in my flashlight beam, and seemed to follow a deliberate path rather than wandering aimlessly. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes of fighting through knee-deep snow, stumbling over hidden rocks and struggling to breathe air so cold it burned my lungs, I saw lights ahead. Not the warm yellow glow of human habitation, but the blue-white glare of highway markers reflecting my flashlight beam. The mysterious footprints had led me directly back to the Dempster Highway, where a highway maintenance crew was setting up emergency shelters for stranded motorists. And within an hour, I was warming up in a heated trailer, while a tow truck driver explained that my SUV had been found on an abandoned logging road that had been closed to public access for over a decade. When I asked about the footprints that had guided me to safety, the maintenance supervisor just shrugged and said that survival situations sometimes make people see things that help them make the right choices. But I still wonder about those tracks that appeared at exactly the moment I needed them most, in conditions where no human should have been able to survive, leading me to safety with an accuracy that GPS technology had failed to provide. After 6 weeks of constant daylight at the research station, Dr. Sarah Martinez stopped sleeping entirely and started drawing symbols on the walls with her own blood. I was the only other person stationed at Herschel Island, and I was beginning to see the same symbols in my peripheral vision. Have you ever experienced sleep deprivation so severe that you couldn't tell what was real anymore? Let me know in the comments how long you've gone without proper sleep. Because what happened to us up there makes me wonder if there's a breaking point where the human mind just snaps. Look, I'm a meteorologist, okay? I deal in facts, data, measurable phenomena, not the kind of weird psychological stuff I'm about to tell you about. But when Environment Canada assigned me to the Herschel Island Research Station for the summer of 2021, I thought I was prepared for the isolation and the midnight sun. I'd done remote postings before, spent months in weather stations across the Arctic, and I figured 2 people could handle 3 months of data collection without any major issues. Dr. Sarah Martinez was supposed to be the perfect partner for this assignment. PhD in atmospheric physics from McGill, 15 years of field experience, and a reputation for being unflappable under pressure. The first few weeks went exactly as planned. We collected weather data, monitored ice conditions, and maintained the automated systems that fed information back to headquarters in Yellowknife. The thing about the midnight sun that they don't really prepare you for is how it messes with your internal clock in ways that blackout curtains and sleeping pills can't fix. Your body knows it should be dark, knows there should be a natural rhythm of day and night. But when you're at 69 degrees north latitude in June, the sun just circles around the sky without ever setting. Sarah adapted better than I did initially. She had this rigid schedule where she'd force herself to sleep from midnight to 8 a.m., regardless of how bright it was outside, complete with eye masks and white noise machines. I was more casual about it, sleeping when I felt tired and working when I felt alert, which probably contributed to what happened later. By the 3rd week, I noticed Sarah was becoming more irritable and obsessive about small details. She'd spend hours recalibrating instruments that were already perfectly calibrated. And she started keeping a detailed journal of every minor equipment malfunction or data anomaly. At first, I thought it was just professional thoroughness. But then I realized she was writing in this journal at all hours. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning to use the bathroom and find her hunched over her notebook, scribbling furiously by the light of the midnight sun streaming through our small windows. When I asked her about it, she just said she was documenting patterns that she was seeing in the data, patterns that I wasn't sophisticated enough to understand. The real warning sign came during week 4 when I caught her standing outside the station at 2 in the morning, staring directly at the sun with no eye protection. I rushed out and pulled her inside, expecting her to be temporarily blinded. But she just looked at me with this strange smile and said the light was talking to her. She claimed she could see mathematical equations in the solar radiation, formulas that explained atmospheric phenomena that mainstream science hadn't discovered yet. I managed to convince her to wear sunglasses during her observations. But I started monitoring her more closely after that incident. Sleep became impossible for both of us by week 5. Sarah had completely abandoned any pretense of a normal schedule and was up for days at a time, filling notebook after notebook with symbols that didn't look like any mathematical notation I'd ever seen. They were geometric patterns, spiral designs, and angular shapes that hurt to look at directly. Not because they were complicated, but because they seemed to shift and move when you weren't focusing on them completely. She started drawing these symbols on the walls of the station with pencil at first, then with ink, and finally with her own blood after she began scratching her fingers raw against the rough wooden surfaces. I tried contacting headquarters on our satellite phone, but the connection was spotty and Sarah would interrupt any conversation by shouting about how they wouldn't understand the breakthrough she was making. The isolation protocols meant that unless we declared a medical emergency, the next supply drop wasn't scheduled until August, and I wasn't sure if what was happening to Sarah qualified as an emergency or just extreme stress. My own judgment was becoming questionable too. After weeks of maybe 3 hours of sleep per night, I was starting to see things that probably weren't there. Shadows moving in the corners of the station and patterns in the ice formations outside that seemed to match Sarah's drawings. The breaking point came during week 6, when I woke up from a brief nap to find Sarah had covered every wall of our main work area with her symbols, drawn in a mixture of blood, ink, and what looked like some kind of paste made from ground-up equipment components. She was standing in the center of the room, rotating slowly with her arms outstretched, chanting numbers in a rhythm that matched the frequency of our weather monitoring equipment. When I tried to approach her, she stopped chanting and told me that the symbols were a communication array that would allow her to speak directly to the atmospheric forces controlling Arctic weather patterns. That's when I started seeing the symbols too. Not just Sarah's drawings, but the same patterns appearing in frost formations on the windows, in the arrangement of clouds on our weather monitoring displays, and in the digital noise that occasionally corrupted our data transmissions. At first, I convinced myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. But the symbols were too consistent and too complex to be random coincidences. They appeared most clearly in my peripheral vision, fading when I tried to look at them directly, which made me question whether they were real or just products of my sleep-deprived brain. Sarah stopped eating during week 7, claiming that food was interfering with her ability to receive transmissions from the atmospheric consciousness she believed was trying to communicate with us. She spent entire days sitting motionless in front of her wall of symbols, occasionally writing down new patterns or making small adjustments to existing drawings. I tried to force her to eat, to sleep, to engage with reality. But she would just stare at me with this vacant expression and ask why I was fighting against the revelation that was being offered to us. My own grip on reality was slipping by this point. I'd been awake for almost 4 days straight, surviving on coffee and energy bars while trying to maintain our equipment and monitor Sarah's deteriorating condition. The symbols were everywhere now, not just in Sarah's drawings, but carved into the wooden beams of the station, etched into the ice outside our windows, and appearing as glitches in our computer displays. I started taking photographs of them with my digital camera. But the images showed only blank walls and normal ice formations. The symbols only appeared to direct human observation, never to recording equipment. The rescue came when I finally managed to get a clear satellite connection and convinced headquarters that we had a medical emergency. The helicopter pilot who extracted us said Sarah was catatonic when they found her, sitting in the middle of her symbol-covered room and staring at the wall without blinking. I was barely coherent myself, babbling about atmospheric consciousness and mathematical communications that made no sense to anyone else. They airlifted us to Yellowknife General Hospital, where we both spent 2 weeks in psychiatric observation while our sleep cycles normalized and the hallucinations gradually faded. The official report blamed our condition on severe sleep deprivation combined with isolation stress and the psychological effects of constant daylight exposure. Sarah recovered more slowly than I did. She spent 6 months in treatment and never returned to field research, eventually taking a teaching position at a community college in southern Ontario. We never discussed what happened at Herschel Island, but sometimes I wonder if those symbols were really hallucinations or if the extreme conditions up there allowed us to perceive something that's normally invisible to human consciousness. I still work for Environment Canada, but only at southern stations now. And I always insist on having a team of at least 4 people for any assignment longer than 2 weeks. Sometimes, during periods of stress or when I'm particularly tired, I catch glimpses of those angular patterns in my peripheral vision. Not the same symbols Sarah drew, but similar geometric forms that seem to exist just outside normal perception. I've never mentioned this to anyone, including the psychiatrists who cleared me for duty, because I'm not sure if seeing them means I'm having a relapse, or if I learned to notice something that was always there, waiting in the spaces between sleeping and waking for minds stressed enough to perceive it. The old-timer at Bonanza Creek said I'd struck gold in the same spot where Freezing Pete died in 1898, but he forgot to mention that Pete never really left. The first sign wasn't the cold spots or the whispers. It was when my metal detector started spelling out messages in Morse code. Have you ever had an experience where you knew something was trying to communicate with you, but you were too scared to listen? Tell me in the comments what you would do if your equipment started behaving in impossible ways. Would you stay and investigate or pack up and leave immediately? So here's the thing about prospecting in the Klondike. Everybody thinks the gold rush ended over a century ago, but there's still plenty of treasure buried in those creeks if you know where to look and you're willing to put in the work. I've been metal detecting as a hobby for about 15 years. Mostly around Vancouver, looking for jewelry and coins. But in 2020, I decided to try my luck in the Yukon during my summer vacation. I'd read about recreational prospecting regulations and figured I could combine camping with treasure hunting, maybe find enough gold flakes to cover my gas money. The area around Dawson City is still open to small-scale prospecting, and there are plenty of old claims that were abandoned when the easy pickings ran out, but might still have something valuable left behind. I set up my camp along Bonanza Creek about 20 kilometers from town, in a spot where an old cabin foundation suggested someone had tried to make a go of it during the original rush. The local outfitter who sold me my prospecting permit was this weathered guy in his 70s named Frank. And when I showed him my claim map, he got this strange look on his face and started telling me stories about the area. According to Frank, the spot I'd chosen was where a prospector named Pete Kowalski had frozen to death during the winter of 1898. Found in his cabin 3 months after the spring thaw with a fortune in gold dust scattered around his body. The story was that Pete had struck it rich but couldn't make it to town before winter set in, and he'd gone crazy from isolation and cold, talking to himself and leaving notes addressed to people who weren't there. Frank said the locals called him Freezing Pete, because even after they buried him in the permafrost, miners working nearby claims reported feeling sudden cold spots and hearing someone muttering in broken English and Polish. I laughed off the ghost stories. I'm a rational guy, I work in IT, and I figured these were just tall tales designed to add some color for the tourists. My metal detector was a pretty sophisticated model, a Minelab CTX 3030 with GPS mapping and digital target identification, and I was more interested in its technical capabilities than in local folklore. The first 2 days of detecting were exactly what I expected. Lots of rusty nails, a few old cans, and some non-ferrous junk that got my hopes up until I dug it out and found corroded brass fittings instead of gold nuggets. The weird stuff started on my 3rd day when I was working a section of creek bank where Frank said Pete's cabin had originally stood. My detector kept getting hits in a pattern that didn't make sense. Instead of the random scattered signals you'd expect from metal debris, I was getting regular pulses that seemed to follow a rhythm. At first, I thought it was interference from power lines or radio transmission. But there wasn't any electrical infrastructure within 50 kilometers of my location. The pulses were definitely coming from underground targets, and they were strong enough to register as large metal objects on my detector's display screen. I started digging in the area where the signals were strongest, and about 2 feet down, I found a small leather pouch containing gold dust and a few small nuggets. Not enough to make me rich, but definitely enough to prove that Pete's fortune was real, and there might be more buried in the vicinity. That's when my detector started acting really strange. Instead of the usual tones and beeps that indicate different types of metal, it began producing patterns of long and short sounds that I eventually realized were Morse code. I'd learned Morse code as a kid when I was into amateur radio, and the messages were clear enough that I could translate them in real time. The first message spelled out, "Help trapped cold so cold," over and over again, which gave me chills, but which I assumed was some kind of equipment malfunction or interference from a distant radio source. Metal detectors can sometimes pick up AM radio signals under certain atmospheric conditions, and I figured I was receiving fragments of an emergency broadcast or maybe a historical reenactment from somewhere in the area. But then the messages became more specific. Pete, Kowalski, Bonanza, Creek Cabin, frozen can't leave. Followed by GPS coordinates that matched my exact location according to my detector's built-in navigation system. I'm a skeptical person by nature, but when your electronic equipment starts spelling out the name of a dead prospector while you're standing on his former claim, it's hard to maintain rational explanations. The temperature around me had dropped noticeably, even though it was a warm July afternoon, and I could see my breath forming small clouds when I exhaled. My detector kept sending Morse code messages, increasingly desperate pleas for help mixed with what sounded like inventory lists of buried gold caches. 5 pounds dust north tree stump and nuggets wrapped oilcloth creek bend were typical of the communications I was receiving. Against my better judgment, I started following the detector's directions, using the Morse code messages as a treasure map to locate Pete's hidden gold stashes. Every location the messages specified contained exactly what was described: pouches of gold dust, nuggets wrapped in deteriorating oilcloth, and small caches of coins that had been buried over a century ago. It was like having a ghostly tour guide leading me to buried treasure. And despite the creepy circumstances, I couldn't resist the lure of finding more gold. The messages became more conversational as the day went on, with Pete apparently responding to my thoughts and actions in real time. When I found a particularly large cache near a lightning-struck pine tree, my detector spelled out, "Thank you, friend Pete, grateful." And the cold spots around me seemed to warm up slightly. I started talking out loud to Pete, thanking him for the guidance and asking questions about his life and death. The responses came through my detector's Morse code transmissions, telling me about the brutal winter of 1898, about running out of food and firewood, about the hallucinations and desperation that came with slow starvation and hypothermia. Pete described hiding his gold in multiple locations because he was paranoid about claim jumpers, and how he died clutching a map showing all his cache locations, a map that was buried with his body. As the sun began to set, the Morse code messages became more urgent and desperate. "Don't leave Pete alone again," and "cold coming back need warmth" were repeated constantly, and I realized that Pete's spirit was somehow drawing energy from my presence and my metal detector's electrical field. The temperature around me continued to drop despite the warm evening, and ice began forming on my equipment, even though the ambient air temperature was well above freezing. I tried to leave several times, but my detector would start screaming out, "No, please stay, help Pete," in rapid-fire Morse code. And guilt kept me from abandoning what seemed to be a genuinely desperate soul. I spent the night at my campsite, with Pete's communications continuing through my metal detector until the battery finally died around 3 in the morning. The sudden silence was almost worse than the constant Morse code messages, and I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness and abandonment that I knew wasn't entirely my own emotion. When I recharged my detector the next morning and turned it on, the first message was, "Thank you for staying, Pete, not alone," followed by GPS coordinates for one final cache that contained more gold than all the previous finds combined. The last message Pete sent before my detector returned to normal operation was, "Pete, can rest now. Gold found, story told, thank you, friend." After that, my metal detector worked exactly as it should, producing normal tones and readings without any Morse code transmissions. The cold spots disappeared, and the area felt like an ordinary stretch of Yukon wilderness rather than a place haunted by a century-old tragedy. I left Dawson City with enough gold to pay for my vacation and a story that I've never told anyone until now. Partly because I know how crazy it sounds, and partly because I'm not sure Pete would want his final resting place disturbed by treasure hunters who might not be as respectful of his memory. I still go prospecting every summer, but I've never had another experience like my encounter with Freezing Pete. Sometimes I wonder if he was really there, communicating through my equipment, or if the isolation and excitement of finding gold had triggered some kind of psychological episode that manifested as supernatural communication. Either way, I hope Pete found the peace he was looking for. And I'm grateful that he chose to share his treasure with someone who listened to his story and treated him with respect rather than fear. The truck driver who picked me up on the winter ice road to Tuktoyaktuk kept checking his rearview mirror and muttering about the follower. When I finally looked back and saw what was keeping pace with us at 80 kilometers per hour across the frozen tundra, I understood why so many vehicles are found abandoned on this route. What's the fastest you've ever seen something move across open ground that definitely wasn't a vehicle? Drop your answer in the comments because I'm still trying to rationalize what I witnessed that night. And maybe someone else has seen something similar. January 2018, and I'm stuck in Inuvik with a broken-down Honda Civic and no way to get back to my job in Edmonton until the spring thaw. Brilliant planning on my part, really. Who drives a compact car to the Arctic in winter? The rental companies wouldn't touch me after I'd already put one vehicle in the ditch, and commercial flights were booked solid for weeks. That's when I met Danny Coe at the Mackenzie Hotel bar, a local trucker who ran supplies up the ice road to Tuk and back. And after enough beers, he agreed to give me a ride south as far as the Dempster Highway junction. Danny was Gwitchin, probably in his 50s. And he had this quiet intensity that made you believe he'd seen things most people wouldn't understand. Danny's rig was a massive Peterbilt with a sleeper cab, pulling a trailer full of construction supplies for the hamlet's infrastructure projects. We left Inuvik around 10 p.m., which put us driving through the coldest part of the night when the ice road was most stable. The route to Tuktoyaktuk follows the frozen Mackenzie River Delta for most of its length, crossing channels and bays that are liquid water for 8 months of the year, but become a highway when the temperature drops below 20 degrees for long enough. It's one of the most isolated roads in North America, 107 kilometers of nothing but snow, ice, and tundra, with no communities, no services, and no help if something goes wrong. The first hour was routine enough. Danny keeping the truck at a steady 50 kilometers per hour while explaining the basics of ice road safety. You don't stop on the ice unless it's an emergency, because the weight of a stationary truck can cause cracks that spread faster than you can move. You don't use your Jake brake because sudden deceleration can break the ice surface. And you absolutely don't travel this route alone, which is why most truckers run in convoys of 2 or 3 vehicles. Danny was solo this trip because his usual partner had called in sick, and he'd been reluctant to take a passenger until I'd offered to pay him enough cash to make it worth the risk. About 30 kilometers out from Inuvik, Danny started glancing at his side mirrors more frequently than seemed necessary for normal driving. The ice road was straight and flat, with visibility for several kilometers in all directions under the aurora-lit sky, so there wasn't much need to check for traffic or obstacles. When I asked if there was a problem, Danny just shrugged and said sometimes other vehicles followed the ice road at night, even though the official season wouldn't start for another 2 weeks and we hadn't seen any other trucks on the route. That's when I first noticed the shape in Danny's passenger side mirror. Something large and dark moving parallel to our truck about 100 meters to the right, keeping pace with us despite the fact that we were traveling at 60 kilometers per hour across terrain that should have been impassable to anything without tracks or skis. At first, I thought it might be a snowmobile or an ATV, but the silhouette was wrong. Too tall and narrow, moving with a fluid gait that didn't match any mechanical vehicle I'd ever seen. Danny caught me staring at the mirror and nodded grimly, like he'd been expecting this to happen. "That's the follower," Danny said, his voice carefully neutral in the way people use when they're discussing something they don't want to believe in, but can't deny. "Shows up on about 1 trip in 10, usually when there's only 1 truck on the road. Never gets closer than 50 meters, never falls behind, just keeps pace until we reach Tuk or turn around." He'd been driving this route for 12 years, he told me, and he'd seen the follower maybe 15 times. Always under similar circumstances. Solo trips, clear weather, nighttime driving when the aurora was active. I pressed my face against the passenger window to get a better look at whatever was paralleling our truck, and what I saw made my stomach clench with instinctive fear. The thing moving alongside us was definitely not human, but it wasn't clearly animal either. Bipedal but wrong, too tall and too angular, with limbs that bent in ways that suggested joints in places where joints shouldn't be. It was covering ground in long, loping strides that ate up distance without apparent effort. And despite the sub-zero temperature and wind chill from our speed, it showed no signs of fatigue or difficulty with the terrain. Danny had been watching my reaction in the rearview mirror, and when he saw the expression on my face, he just nodded again. "Yeah, that's about how everyone reacts the first time they see it. Thing is, it's not actually threatening. Never approaches the truck, never shows aggressive behavior, just follows along like it's curious about what we're doing out here. Some of the other drivers think it's territorial, making sure we don't stay in the area too long, but I figure it's more like a dog following a car because it finds the movement interesting." The follower stayed with us for the next 40 kilometers, never varying its distance or position relative to our truck, never showing any signs of strain despite maintaining highway speeds across frozen tundra that would challenge a snowmobile. I tried taking pictures with my phone, but the combination of darkness, distance, and vibration from the truck made it impossible to get clear images. The creature, because I couldn't think of it as anything else, seemed to be aware of my attention. occasionally turning what might have been its head in our direction, but never altering its pace or path. Around the halfway point to Tuktoyaktuk, we hit a section of road where the ice had shifted and created pressure ridges that forced Danny to slow down and navigate carefully between frozen obstacles. I expected the follower to either catch up to us or fall behind, but instead it simply adjusted its own speed to match ours, maintaining the same relative position even when we were crawling along at 20 kilometers per hour. That's when I realized that whatever was out there had intelligence. It wasn't just running mindlessly alongside our truck, but was actively choosing to stay within a specific range. Danny had been quiet for most of the journey, but as we approached the final stretch to Tuktoyaktuk, he started talking about the other encounters he'd had with the follower over the years. Different drivers described it differently. Some said it looked like a bear walking upright. Others thought it resembled a person in heavy winter clothing, and a few claimed it was something they'd never seen before and couldn't compare to any known animal. The one constant was its behavior. It would appear shortly after leaving Inuvik, follow trucks for most of the journey, and disappear when they reached populated areas or when other vehicles joined the convoy. "The thing that gets me," Danny said as the lights of Tuktoyaktuk appeared in the distance, "is how it always knows when to leave. Soon as we get within a few kilometers of town, or if another truck shows up on the road behind us, it just veers off into the tundra and vanishes. Like it understands that its territory ends at the edge of human settlement. Or maybe it just doesn't want to be seen by too many people at once." Sure enough, as we crested the last hill before dropping down into Tuktoyaktuk, I looked out the passenger window and saw the follower angle away from our route, heading northwest across the open tundra at the same steady pace it had maintained for over 100 kilometers. Within minutes, it had disappeared into the darkness, leaving no tracks visible on the windswept snow and no evidence that it had ever been there, except for the memories of two witnesses who'd shared an encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Danny dropped me off at the community center in Tuktoyaktuk, where I caught a ride south with another trucker the next morning. I never saw the follower again, but I spent months researching similar encounters online and found scattered reports from other ice road drivers, commercial pilots, and research station personnel describing bipedal creatures that showed unusual intelligence and territorial behavior in remote Arctic locations. Most of these accounts were dismissed as misidentified wildlife or products of isolation stress. But the consistency of the descriptions and behaviors suggests that something is out there in the Yukon and Northwest Territories, something that's learned to coexist with human activity while maintaining its distance from our settlements. I still don't know what the follower was. Undiscovered species, surviving population of something science considers extinct, or maybe just a shared hallucination brought on by isolation and extreme cold. What I do know is that Danny Coe wasn't lying about his previous encounters, and that whatever followed our truck across the tundra that night was real, intelligent, and perfectly adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, following other lonely trucks across the ice roads, curious about these strange metal creatures that invade its territory for a few months each winter before disappearing again with the spring thaw. The northern lights over Whitehorse were supposed to be beautiful, but that night they pulsed in patterns that hurt to look at directly. By morning, half the town was missing, and those of us who remained had memories of walking toward the lights that we couldn't quite recall ending. Have you ever felt compelled to do something that you knew was dangerous but couldn't resist? Tell me in the comments about a time when your instincts told you to run, but something else made you stay. Because what happened in Whitehorse that March night still haunts everyone who survived it. Listen, I know how this sounds before I even start. but I was the night shift supervisor at the Whitehorse Water Treatment Plant. And what I'm about to tell you is documented in official incident reports that the territorial government sealed under some kind of public safety classification. March 15, 2022, was supposed to be a routine night. Check the filtration systems, monitor chlorine levels, respond to any automated alarms that might indicate problems with the city's water supply. I'd been doing this job for 8 years, and the biggest excitement I usually dealt with was a pump failure or a pressure drop in one of the distribution lines. The aurora forecast that night called for high activity due to solar storm conditions, but that wasn't unusual for March in the Yukon. And I was actually looking forward to seeing a good display during my patrol rounds. The first sign something was wrong came around 11 p.m. when my radio started picking up transmissions that weren't supposed to be there. Voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, mixed with what sounded like mathematical equations being read aloud in monotone voices. I assumed it was atmospheric interference from the solar activity bouncing signals from distant radio stations. But the transmissions were too clear and too consistent to be random propagation effects. The voices were discussing coordinates, time intervals, and what sounded like population counts, all delivered in the flat, emotionless tone that automated systems use for emergency broadcasts. I stepped outside to check the aurora conditions around midnight, and what I saw in the sky above Whitehorse was unlike any Northern Lights display I'd witnessed in my 34 years living in the Yukon. Instead of the usual green curtains and dancing ribbons, the aurora was forming geometric patterns, perfect circles, triangles, and spiral configurations that pulsed in synchronized rhythms. The colors were wrong too, shifting between deep purples and electric blues that seemed almost artificial, like stage lighting rather than natural atmospheric phenomena. Most disturbing was the way the patterns seemed to respond to human observation, brightening and intensifying when people looked directly at them. By 12:30 a.m., my radio was flooded with emergency calls from RCMP dispatch, the hospital, and city services reporting that citizens were leaving their homes and walking toward the downtown core in large numbers. The calls described people of all ages moving through the streets in the same direction, not responding to questions or attempts to redirect them, walking with a purposeful stride toward the riverfront area where the aurora appeared most intense. I could see them from my position at the treatment plant. Hundreds of dark figures moving like sleepwalkers through the snow-covered streets, converging on the area near the SS Klondike Historic Site. I should have stayed at my post and continued monitoring the water systems. But something about the aurora display was pulling at my attention in a way I couldn't resist. Every time I tried to focus on my equipment readings or administrative tasks, my eyes would drift toward the windows and the pulsing lights in the sky. It wasn't like normal curiosity or interest. It felt more like a physical compulsion, as if the aurora was generating some kind of magnetic field that affected human neural activity. The radio transmissions had evolved into what sounded like countdown sequences in multiple languages, and I found myself unconsciously synchronizing my breathing with the rhythm of the numerical announcements, against every professional instinct I possessed. I locked up the treatment plant and started walking toward downtown, joining the stream of people moving through the streets toward the riverfront. I remember making the decision consciously, but I couldn't articulate why it seemed necessary or what I expected to accomplish by abandoning my post. The other people I encountered were similarly entranced. They responded to direct questions with vacant nods, but couldn't explain why they were walking through sub-zero temperatures without proper winter clothing, or what they hoped to find at their destination. The crowd gathering near the SS Klondike was larger than I'd expected from the radio reports. Easily 1,000 people standing in the snow, all facing north toward the most intense part of the aurora display. What struck me as profoundly wrong was the complete silence, despite the size of the gathering. No conversations, no children crying, no normal sounds of a large group of people in an outdoor environment. Everyone was simply standing and watching the geometric patterns in the sky, which had evolved into increasingly complex configurations that seemed to convey information in a visual language none of us consciously understood. I found myself standing next to Margaret Chen, who managed the downtown Tim Hortons and lived in my neighborhood. But when I tried to talk to her, she just stared at the aurora and whispered numbers under her breath. Coordinates and time codes that matched the radio transmissions I'd been hearing at the treatment plant. Other people around us were doing the same thing, reciting data in voices that didn't sound entirely like their own, as if they were serving as biological relay stations for information being transmitted through the aurora display. The geometric patterns in the sky reached some kind of crescendo around 2 a.m., forming configurations so complex and rapidly changing that looking at them directly caused physical discomfort, headaches, nausea, and visual disturbances that persisted even when I closed my eyes. That's when the crowd began moving again, not dispersing back to their homes, but walking north along the Yukon River toward the wilderness areas beyond the city limits. I followed because everyone else was following, driven by the same inexplicable compulsion that had brought me to the riverfront in the first place. My memories of what happened next are fragmentary and contradictory. Images of walking through snow-covered forest, of standing in clearings where the aurora seemed close enough to touch, of voices that spoke without sound and conveyed meaning without words. I remember feeling that I was participating in something important and necessary, but I couldn't define what that something was or why it required the involvement of half of Whitehorse's population. The experience felt like being part of a vast biological computer, with each person serving as a processing node in a calculation too complex for individual human comprehension. I regained normal consciousness around 6 a.m., lying in the snow about 15 kilometers north of Whitehorse, with no clear memory of how I'd gotten there or what I'd been doing for the previous several hours. Emergency services were conducting search and rescue operations throughout the area, finding hundreds of people in similar conditions, conscious but disoriented, suffering from mild hypothermia, with no coherent recollection of the night's events. The official count showed that approximately 1,200 residents had disappeared from their homes during the night, but only about 600 were recovered during the search operations. The missing people were never found, despite extensive search efforts that continued for weeks. No bodies, no evidence of where they'd gone, no tracks leading away from the areas where the recovered individuals were discovered. The territorial government classified the incident as a mass psychological event, triggered by unusual atmospheric conditions, but they sealed all the detailed reports and reassigned most of the first responders to different positions. The radio transmissions I'd recorded at the treatment plant were dismissed as interference from military communications satellites, and the geometric aurora patterns were explained as rare but documented variations in magnetic field interactions. I kept working at the water treatment plant for another 6 months, but I could never completely shake the feeling that something fundamentally important had happened that night, something that the official explanations couldn't account for. The missing residents were eventually declared legally dead after the standard waiting period, but their disappearance left holes in the community that never quite healed. Margaret Chen's Tim Hortons closed permanently because no one could be found to take over the franchise, and several local businesses never reopened after their owners vanished during the Aurora event. I moved to Vancouver in late 2022, partly for better job opportunities, but mostly because I couldn't handle living in a place where the northern lights might return and finish whatever they'd started that March night. I still monitor aurora forecasts obsessively, And whenever high activity is predicted for the Yukon region, I make sure I'm indoors with the curtains drawn and the radio turned off. Sometimes I wonder if the missing residents are still out there somewhere, serving their function in whatever cosmic process required their participation, and whether the rest of us were released because we were deemed unnecessary for the completion of the task, or simply because we weren't suitable for long-term integration into something larger than human consciousness. Discovery Mine was abandoned in 1966 after a cave-in killed 12 workers. But when I explored the ruins 50 years later, I found fresh food in the company store and warm ashes in the fireplace. The strangest part wasn't finding signs of recent habitation. It was realizing that the mine shaft was still operational and someone was still working it. Have you ever explored an abandoned place only to discover it wasn't as abandoned as you thought? Let me know in the comments if you've ever found evidence that someone was living in a place that should have been empty for decades. Because what I discovered at Discovery Mine challenges everything I thought I knew about ghost towns. All right. So I'm what you'd call an urban explorer. Though I guess rural explorer is more accurate when you're dealing with abandoned settlements in the Yukon Territory. I've been documenting ghost towns and abandoned industrial sites across northern Canada for my photography blog. And Discovery Mine had been on my list for years before I finally made the trip in August 2016. The place has a fascinating history. It was a significant copper operation during the 1940s and 50s, employing over 200 people at its peak, with a complete company town, including housing, a school, a general store, and all the infrastructure needed to support families in the remote wilderness, about 150 kilometers northeast of Whitehorse. The mine closed officially in 1966, following a catastrophic cave-in that killed 12 miners and made further operations economically unfeasible, according to the territorial mining records I'd researched. The company town was evacuated within 6 months, with most of the valuable equipment and materials transported out by helicopter and truck convoy. What remained was supposed to be a standard industrial ghost town. Empty buildings slowly deteriorating under the harsh northern climate, with nature gradually reclaiming the cleared areas where people had once lived and worked. I'd seen dozens of similar sites throughout my exploration career, and I expected Discovery to follow the same pattern of abandonment and decay. The hike to Discovery took me 2 days through unmarked wilderness, following old logging roads and mining trails that were barely visible after 50 years of neglect. I was carrying camping gear, photography equipment, and enough food for a week-long exploration, planning to document the site thoroughly before hiking back to my vehicle. When I finally reached the settlement, my first impression was that it was remarkably well preserved compared to other abandoned mining operations I'd visited. The buildings were still structurally sound, with roofs intact and minimal damage from weather or vandalism. But as I got closer to the main cluster of buildings, I started noticing details that didn't fit the timeline of abandonment. The windows of the company store were clean, not just unbroken, but actually clean, as if someone had been maintaining them regularly. The walkways between buildings had been cleared of debris and showed signs of recent foot traffic, with boot prints in the mud that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Most significantly, I could smell wood smoke in the air, which meant someone had been burning fires recently enough that the scent lingered in the still mountain air. I approached the company store cautiously, uncertain whether I was dealing with squatters, caretakers, or some kind of industrial security presence that I hadn't been aware of in my research. The front door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning that this wasn't a typical abandoned site. But curiosity overcame caution, and I pushed inside to find what looked like an operational general store from the 1960s. The shelves were stocked with canned goods, dry goods, and household supplies, all arranged neatly and showing no signs of age or deterioration that you'd expect from products that had been sitting in an abandoned building for 5 decades. I picked up a can of beans from one of the shelves and checked the expiration date, expecting to find it either missing or decades out of date. But the label showed a best buy date that was still 6 months in the future. The same was true for everything else I examined. Bread that was still soft, milk that was still cold in a refrigerator that was somehow running despite the fact that there were no power lines to the abandoned settlement, and newspapers dated from the previous week that described current events I recognized from my own reading. Either someone was actively maintaining and resupplying this store, or I was experiencing some kind of temporal anomaly that allowed current products to exist in an abandoned 1960s building. The residential area of the settlement showed similar signs of ongoing habitation: clothes hung on lines between houses, gardens that were clearly being tended and watered, and children's toys scattered in yards as if kids had been playing there recently and had simply gone inside for dinner. The incongruity was overwhelming. Here was a ghost town that wasn't actually ghostly, showing every sign of an active community despite the complete absence of any visible residents. I called out several times, announcing my presence and asking if anyone was around, but received no response except for the echo of my own voice bouncing off the surrounding mountains. The mine entrance itself was the most disturbing discovery of all. According to the historical records, the shaft had been sealed with concrete and steel barriers after the 1966 cave-in, both to prevent unauthorized access and to contain any hazardous materials that might be present in the flooded lower levels. But when I reached the mine head, I found the entrance wide open, with fresh tire tracks leading in and out of the tunnel mouth. Industrial lighting was strung along the ceiling of the main shaft, powered by generators that I could hear running deep underground. And the air coming out of the mine carried the familiar smells of diesel exhaust and blasting powder that indicated active mining operations. I didn't have the equipment or the expertise to explore the mine shaft safely, but I spent several hours documenting the surface evidence of ongoing activity. Fresh ore samples were piled near the entrance, sorted and tagged with dates from the current year. Heavy equipment tracks crisscrossed the area around the mine head, and I could see where large trucks had been backing up to loading areas to transport materials out of the site. The level of industrial activity was inconsistent with any kind of small-scale or recreational mining. This was a full commercial operation with significant investment in equipment and infrastructure. That evening, I set up my camp on a ridge overlooking the settlement, hoping to observe any activity that might occur after dark. Around 9 p.m., lights began coming on in the buildings below, following the pattern you'd expect from a community settling in for the night. Kitchen windows glowing as families prepared dinner, streetlights illuminating the main roads, and the warm yellow glow of television screens visible through living room windows. I could hear the faint sounds of daily life carrying up from the valley: dogs barking, children playing, adults calling to each other across yards. But despite watching through binoculars for hours, I never saw a single human figure moving around the settlement. The mine operation continued throughout the night, with convoy trucks arriving and departing on a regular schedule, their headlights visible as they navigated the access road that led back toward the main highway. The industrial noise was constant: generators, conveyor belts, heavy machinery, and the distant sound of blasting deep underground. But again, I couldn't see any workers or equipment operators despite clear evidence that complex industrial processes were taking place. It was like watching a ghost town operate itself, maintaining the routines and activities of a living community without any visible human presence. I stayed for 3 more days, documenting everything I could and trying to make contact with whatever was maintaining the settlement. I left notes in obvious locations, tried using my radio to broadcast on emergency frequencies, and even attempted to follow one of the mine trucks when it left the site. But the vehicle disappeared around a bend in the road and was gone when I reached the same location on foot. On my final night, I woke up to find that someone had left fresh food and coffee outside my tent, along with a handwritten note that simply said, "Thank you for visiting Discovery. Please don't tell anyone where we are." I hiked out the next morning with more questions than answers, carrying photographs and documentation of a place that shouldn't exist, according to official records. My attempts to research the current legal status of the Discovery mine site led to bureaucratic dead ends and conflicting information from different government agencies. Some records showed the site as permanently abandoned and sealed. Others indicated that mining leases were still active under corporate entities that I couldn't trace to actual business addresses or contact information. I never published my photographs or wrote about Discovery for my blog, partly because I couldn't verify the story, and partly because I felt obligated to respect the privacy request in that anonymous note. I've never returned to Discovery, but I still monitor mining industry publications for any mention of copper operations in that region of the Yukon. And I occasionally see references to production figures that suggest active extraction is taking place somewhere in the area. Whether Discovery Mine is operated by the descendants of the original workers, by some kind of corporate entity that maintains secrecy for business reasons, or by something else entirely, I can't say with certainty. But I know that what I experienced there was real, and that the place continues to exist in a state that defies the official narrative of abandonment and closure. I rented the remote cabin near Kluane Lake for a month-long writing retreat. But the previous guest's journal entries carved into the wooden walls told a different story about what happens when you stay too long. The final entry, dated just 3 days before my arrival, simply read, "They're in the walls now, and they know I can hear them." Have you ever felt like you were being watched in a place where you should have been completely alone? Tell me in the comments about the longest you've ever been isolated from other people. Because isolation does things to your mind that you can't prepare for until you experience it firsthand. Look, I'm a freelance journalist from Toronto, and I thought I knew what isolation meant from working alone in my apartment for months at a time. But nothing prepares you for true wilderness solitude, where your nearest neighbor is literally hundreds of kilometers away. I'd booked the cabin through a property rental website, looking for somewhere remote enough to finish my book about urban alienation without the constant distractions of city life. The listing described a rustic but comfortable retreat on the shores of Kluane Lake, accessible only by float plane or a brutal 4-hour ATV ride through unmarked trails. Perfect for writers seeking authentic wilderness inspiration away from modern connectivity. The property owner, a guy named Marcus, who ran wilderness tours out of Whitehorse, had been upfront about the isolation factor when we spoke on the phone. No cell service, no internet, no landline telephone, and the nearest emergency services were at least 6 hours away under ideal conditions. The cabin was provisioned with a month's worth of non-perishable food, a propane generator for electricity, and enough firewood to last through unexpected weather. But once the float plane dropped me off, I'd be completely on my own until the scheduled pickup date. Marcus had warned me that some people couldn't handle the psychological impact of total isolation, and that I should be prepared for my mental state to change in ways I might not expect. The first thing I noticed when I walked into the cabin wasn't the stunning view of Kluane Lake or the cozy interior design, but the carved writing covering nearly every wooden surface in the main room. Someone had used a knife or similar tool to scratch words and phrases into the walls, the ceiling beams, the window frames, and even the floorboards. creating a chaotic tapestry of text that documented what appeared to be a gradual descent into paranoia and madness. The carvings weren't random graffiti. They were journal entries, observations, and increasingly desperate attempts at communication, all attributed to someone named Jennifer, who had apparently stayed in the cabin during the previous month. Jennifer's early entries were mundane enough. Day 3, weather clear, good riding conditions, and Day 7, saw moose family at water's edge this morning. But as I read through the chronological progression of carvings, the tone shifted dramatically toward anxiety and fear. Day 12, something moving around the cabin at night, too big to be squirrels, escalated to Day 18. They know I'm here. They're testing the doors and windows. And eventually to Day 23. Sleep is impossible. They whisper my name through the walls. I called Marcus on my satellite phone to ask about Jennifer and whether there had been any incidents I should know about. But he claimed not to know what I was talking about. According to his records, the cabin had been empty for 3 months before my arrival, and he'd never rented to anyone named Jennifer. He suggested that the carvings were probably old damage from previous years that he hadn't noticed during his last maintenance visit, and that isolation sometimes makes people more sensitive to normal wilderness sounds and activity. His explanation made logical sense, but the dates carved into the walls corresponded exactly with the month before my arrival, and the wood shavings around the most recent entries were still fresh and light-colored. The first week of my stay was productive and peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for when I'd planned this retreat. I established a daily routine of writing in the morning, hiking in the afternoon, and reading by the fire in the evening, with no distractions beyond the occasional wildlife sighting or weather change. The silence was profound in a way that city dwellers never experience. Not just the absence of traffic and machinery, but the complete lack of human-generated sound for hours at a time. It was during these quiet periods that I began to understand how Jennifer might have started hearing things that weren't there. Because the human brain seems to fill silence with phantom sounds when it's deprived of normal auditory input. By the second week, I was spending more time reading Jennifer's wall carvings than working on my own writing project. Her documentation was detailed and systematic, describing specific sounds, times of occurrence, and her attempts to identify natural explanations for what she was experiencing. Day 15. Scratching sounds in attic space, investigated but found no evidence of animal intrusion. And Day 19. Rhythmic tapping on north wall, intervals too regular to be branch movement, suggested that whatever Jennifer had heard was persistent and patterned rather than random. I started paying attention to the nighttime sounds around the cabin, partly out of curiosity about Jennifer's experiences and partly because isolation had made me hyper-aware of my environment in ways that felt simultaneously protective and paranoid. The Yukon wilderness is never completely silent. There's always wind in the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, and the thermal expansion and contraction of building materials creating settling noises. But some of the sounds I heard didn't fit those categories. Deliberate footsteps circling the cabin at regular intervals, scratching or tapping that responded to my movements inside the building, and what sounded like human voices just beyond the range of clear comprehension. Jennifer's later entries described exactly the same phenomena I was experiencing, which either meant we were both responding to real external stimuli or that isolation in this specific location produced predictable psychological effects. Day 25. They speak in whispers when they think I'm asleep. Discussing my daily routines and what I eat for meals was particularly disturbing, because I'd heard similar whispered conversations and had found myself wondering if someone was observing my activities from a hidden position in the surrounding forest. The scratching sounds in the walls became more frequent and aggressive as my stay progressed, following patterns that reminded me of Morse code or some other form of systematic communication. I tried recording these sounds with my digital audio equipment, but playback revealed only normal background noise and the occasional settling sound that could be attributed to the wooden structure responding to temperature changes. Either the sounds were psychological artifacts that recording equipment couldn't capture, or they were occurring at frequencies or volumes that weren't registering on my devices. Jennifer's final entries, carved deep into the wooden beam above the fireplace, described her growing conviction that entities living within the cabin's structure were actively monitoring her thoughts and activities. Day 28. They know what I'm going to do before I do it, preparing for my actions in advance. And Day 30. Communication attempt successful. They acknowledge my presence, but won't reveal their intentions. Suggested that she'd progressed from hearing phantom sounds to believing she was engaged in actual dialogue with invisible beings. I found myself following a similar trajectory, spending hours each night listening to the sounds in the walls and trying to establish patterns or responses that might indicate intelligence rather than random occurrence. The isolation was definitely affecting my judgment. I was attributing significance to coincidental events, finding meaningful patterns in random data, and developing elaborate theories about the cabin's history and previous occupants. But I couldn't completely dismiss the possibility that something unusual was actually happening, because the sounds and experiences were too consistent and too specific to be entirely psychological. My breaking point came during the third week when I woke up to find fresh knife marks in the wooden walls, adding to Jennifer's collection of carved entries, but in handwriting that I didn't recognize as my own. The new carvings described my daily activities and thoughts with accuracy that suggested either I was unconsciously documenting my own experiences or someone else was observing me closely enough to know intimate details about my mental state. Day 22. Subject experiencing auditory hallucinations consistent with previous occupant patterns was carved in block letters that looked like my handwriting, but described me in the third person as if I were being studied by an external observer. I contacted Marcus via satellite phone to arrange early pickup, claiming a family emergency that required my immediate return to Toronto. The float plane arrived within 24 hours, and I spent my final night at the cabin barricaded in the bedroom with furniture blocking the door, listening to increasingly aggressive scratching and tapping sounds that seemed to be trying to communicate urgency or distress. When I left the next morning, I carved my own final entry into the door frame. Day 23. Whatever lives in this place feeds on isolation and fear. Future guests should be warned. I never published my book about urban alienation, partly because my wilderness experience had made me question my own perceptions, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that the entities in the cabin walls were still monitoring my thoughts and activities even after I'd returned to civilization. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn in my Toronto apartment, I hear familiar scratching sounds in the walls and wonder if isolation changed me permanently, or if I brought something back with me from that remote cabin where the boundaries between reality and psychological breakdown become dangerously thin. The construction crew said the permafrost was melting faster than expected, but they didn't mention what was preserved inside the ice for thousands of years. When we started finding the bodies, intact, ancient, and somehow still warm to the touch, we realized we should have left them buried. Have you ever touched something that felt fundamentally wrong? Like your body knew it was dangerous before your mind could process why? Drop a comment about the strangest thing you've ever found buried or hidden, because what we uncovered in that Yukon construction site still gives me nightmares about what might be sleeping under the ice. My name is Dave Kowalski, and I've been operating heavy machinery for Northern Infrastructure Solutions for 12 years, mostly on government contracts, building roads, and installing utilities in remote communities across the territories. Summer of 2020 found me running a backhoe on a water treatment facility project outside Mayo, digging foundation trenches in permafrost that was supposed to stay frozen year-round, but had been turning into mud thanks to the abnormal heat we'd been experiencing. The environmental assessment had warned us about unstable ground conditions due to climate change, but nobody mentioned the possibility of uncovering archaeological materials or having to deal with the kind of discoveries that would shut down a project indefinitely. The first body came up on a Tuesday morning in July, about 3 meters down in what should have been solid permafrost, but was instead a soupy mixture of ice, mud, and organic matter that looked like it had been thawing for weeks. I'd been digging steadily when my bucket scraped against something that felt different from the usual rocks and frozen debris, softer but more substantial. And when I pulled back the hydraulic arm, there was a human leg sticking out of the disturbed earth, complete with what looked like leather clothing and fur boots that seemed impossibly well preserved for something that had obviously been buried for a very long time. I shut down the machine and called over Tom Henderson, our site supervisor, expecting him to contact the RCMP and shut down operations while we dealt with what was probably a crime scene or unmarked grave that would require archaeological investigation. But when Tom climbed down into the trench to examine what I'd found, his reaction was completely different from what I'd expected. Instead of concern or professional caution, he seemed excited, almost eager, and he told me to keep digging carefully to see if there were more remains in the same area. The second and third bodies were located within an hour, positioned in what appeared to be intentional arrangements rather than random burial positions. All three were remarkably preserved, with clothing, hair, and even facial features intact, despite having been frozen in permafrost for what our geologist estimated was at least several thousand years, based on the soil stratification and organic matter analysis. But the strangest aspect wasn't their preservation. It was the fact that they felt warm to direct touch, as if body heat was still being generated somehow, despite the obvious antiquity of the remains. Tom made a series of phone calls to numbers I didn't recognize, speaking in hushed tones and using terminology that sounded more like corporate jargon than construction management. And within 6 hours, we had a team of specialists on site who definitely weren't from any government agency I'd dealt with before. They arrived by helicopter, carrying equipment that looked more sophisticated than anything archaeologists typically use. And they immediately established a perimeter around our excavation site that prevented any of the regular crew from getting close to the remains. The specialists, who never introduced themselves or explained their organizational affiliation, took over the excavation process using techniques that seemed designed to preserve not just the physical integrity of the bodies, but also some kind of environmental conditions that I didn't understand. They installed temperature monitoring equipment, air filtration systems, and containment protocols that seemed excessive for handling archaeological specimens. And they required everyone on the regular construction crew to sign additional confidentiality agreements before we were allowed to continue working in adjacent areas. Over the following 2 weeks, the specialist team uncovered 17 more bodies from the same general area, all showing the same impossible preservation and residual warmth that had characterized the initial discoveries. The bodies were arranged in distinct groupings that suggested some kind of social organization or ritual significance, and several were accompanied by artifacts that our geologist privately admitted didn't match any known indigenous culture from the region. The specialists documented everything with equipment that recorded not just visual and physical data, but also electromagnetic readings, temperature fluctuations, and atmospheric composition in ways that suggested they were monitoring for biological activity rather than just cataloging historical remains. I started having health problems during the 3rd week of excavation, beginning with persistent headaches and progressing to nausea, disorientation, and episodes of memory loss that would leave me unable to remember entire conversations or work activities. Several other crew members reported similar symptoms, particularly those of us who had been working closest to the excavation site. And I noticed that the specialists were wearing protective equipment that seemed more appropriate for handling hazardous materials than ancient human remains. The turning point came when Jake Morrison, one of our equipment operators, had what appeared to be a seizure while working near the main excavation area and was rushed to Mayo Clinic by helicopter. Jake recovered within a few hours, but he kept talking about dreams or visions he'd experienced during the episode. Detailed scenarios involving the ancient people whose bodies we'd uncovered, as if he'd somehow accessed their memories or experienced events from their lives. The medical staff dismissed this as hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation. But Jake's descriptions of pre-contact indigenous life in the region were historically accurate in ways that he couldn't have known from his own education or experience. The specialists became increasingly secretive as more bodies were recovered, restricting access to the site and implementing communication protocols that prevented us from discussing our findings with anyone outside the project team. They brought in additional equipment that looked more like laboratory instruments than archaeological tools, and I started noticing that they were collecting tissue samples and conducting tests that seemed designed to determine whether the preserved bodies were actually dead or merely dormant in some way. My last day on the project was a Friday in early August, when I was operating the backhoe near the periphery of the main excavation site, and accidentally broke through into what appeared to be a larger chamber or cavity beneath the surface. The bucket came up with several artifacts that I'd never seen before. Carved objects that seemed to be made from some kind of organic material and covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly, like staring at them caused immediate eye strain and headaches. The specialists reacted to this discovery with obvious alarm rather than professional interest, immediately halting all excavation activities and implementing what they called containment protocols that involved sealing the entire site with industrial plastic sheeting and establishing a quarantine perimeter around the area. They terminated the contracts for all regular construction crew members that same afternoon, citing project completion ahead of schedule, even though we'd barely begun the actual construction work that we'd been hired to perform. I received my final paycheck along with an enhanced non-disclosure agreement that included specific penalties for discussing the discoveries or my experiences on the project, but also included a medical monitoring provision that required me to report any health problems or unusual symptoms to a contact number that wasn't associated with Northern Infrastructure Solutions. The agreement also included a relocation bonus that would pay for me to move to a different province if I chose to leave the Yukon, which seemed like an unusual provision for a routine construction project. I moved to Alberta 6 months later, partly because the medical monitoring requirements were making me paranoid about my health, and partly because I kept having dreams similar to what Jake Morrison had described. Vivid scenarios involving the preserved bodies and their apparent lives in a time period that predated known human habitation of the region. The dreams were so detailed and consistent that I started researching pre-contact indigenous history, looking for evidence that might explain what we'd uncovered. But I found only gaps and contradictions in the archaeological record for that specific area. 3 years later, I still receive quarterly medical checkups that are paid for by an organization I've never heard of. And I'm required to submit blood samples and undergo cognitive testing that monitors for changes in memory, perception, and neurological function. The medical staff won't explain what they're testing for, but they've made it clear that the monitoring is related to my exposure to biological materials during the Mayo project, and that similar protocols are being followed for everyone who worked at the site. I've tried researching what happened to the construction project and whether the water treatment facility was ever completed, but official records show that the project was canceled due to environmental concerns, and the site was designated as protected territory under a classification I can't find definitions for in any public documents. Sometimes I wonder if those preserved bodies were actually dead, or if we disturbed something that had been dormant in the permafrost for thousands of years, waiting for climate change to provide the right conditions for awakening. And whether the specialists were trying to study them or trying to contain something that shouldn't have been released from its frozen tomb. The emergency radio at our hunting camp near Old Crow picked up a distress call from coordinates that placed the caller somewhere in the middle of the Porcupine River. But the voice sounded exactly like my hunting partner, who was sitting right next to me. When we investigated the location the next morning, we found our own campsite from 3 days in the future, complete with our dead bodies. Have you ever heard your own voice saying things you never said? Or found evidence of your own presence in a place you'd never been? Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something that made you question the nature of time itself. Because what happened at our hunting camp near Old Crow still makes me wonder if we actually survived that trip or if we're somehow still trapped in a loop that hasn't ended yet. Right. So I need to explain this carefully, because even I don't fully understand what happened during our moose hunting expedition in September 2019. And I'm the one who lived through it, if lived through it is even the correct way to describe our experience. My hunting partner, Carl Bjornsson, and I have been making annual trips to the Porcupine River area for over 15 years, always during the early fall when the bull moose are in rut and the weather conditions are ideal for backcountry camping. We know this region better than most people know their own neighborhoods, and we've established regular campsites at specific GPS coordinates that we return to year after year because they offer good hunting access, clean water sources, and natural wind breaks for our tent setup. This particular trip started normally enough. We flew into Old Crow on a chartered bush plane, hired local guides to transport our gear by boat up the Porcupine River to our traditional campsite, and established our base camp in the same location we'd used successfully for the past 5 seasons. Our emergency communication equipment included a satellite phone for check-ins with our families and a VHF emergency radio that monitored standard distress frequencies and could broadcast our location to search and rescue services if necessary. The weather forecast was favorable, our equipment was in excellent condition, and we had enough supplies for a 2-week stay with plenty of safety margin built into our food and fuel calculations. The first sign that something unusual was happening came on our 3rd night when Carl and I were sharing evening coffee by the campfire, and our emergency radio began picking up a distress transmission on the international emergency frequency. The signal was clear and strong, indicating a nearby source, but the content of the message was immediately disturbing because the voice making the distress call sounded exactly like Carl's voice, asking for emergency evacuation from coordinates that placed the caller in the middle of the Porcupine River, about 3 kilometers downstream from our campsite. Carl was sitting directly across from me when we heard his voice on the radio, and his reaction was the same confusion and disbelief that I was experiencing. The transmission repeated every few minutes for about an hour, with Carl's voice providing increasingly detailed information about injuries, equipment failures, and deteriorating weather conditions that didn't match our actual situation at all. We were both healthy, our equipment was functioning perfectly, and the weather remained clear and calm, despite the distress caller's claims about an incoming storm system. I attempted to respond to the distress call using our radio, asking for clarification about the caller's identity and actual location, but received no response despite the continued transmission of emergency messages every few minutes. The voice on the radio was definitely Carl's, not just similar or reminiscent, but identical in accent, speech patterns, and specific vocabulary that only someone who knew Carl well would recognize. But Carl was obviously not making these transmissions, and the coordinates being broadcast placed the distress caller in a location that was physically impossible to occupy, since it was in the middle of deep, fast-moving water. The transmission continued sporadically throughout the night, with the voice that sounded like Carl describing a progressively worsening survival situation that included equipment failures, injuries, and approaching weather conditions that would make rescue operations impossible. By morning, the messages had evolved to include my voice as well, with Dave's voice and Carl's voice apparently having conversations about our deteriorating situation and arguing about whether to attempt to signal for help or try to reach safety on our own. Carl and I decided to investigate the coordinates being broadcast in the distress calls, partly out of scientific curiosity and partly because we were concerned that someone might actually be in distress and using some kind of voice modification technology that we didn't understand. We loaded our canoe with emergency rescue equipment and paddled downstream to the GPS location that had been repeatedly broadcast during the night, expecting to find either another hunting party in genuine distress or some kind of technical explanation for the impossible radio transmissions we'd been receiving. What we found at the specified coordinates was a small island in the middle of the Porcupine River that neither of us had ever noticed during our previous trips to the area, despite having traveled this stretch of river dozens of times over the years. The island was maybe 50 meters long and 20 meters wide, covered with the same boreal forest vegetation as the surrounding riverbanks. But it felt wrong in ways that I couldn't articulate at the time. Too symmetrical, too well-defined, too obviously artificial despite looking completely natural. On the island, we discovered what appeared to be our own campsite, complete with our tent, our equipment, and what looked like our personal belongings arranged exactly as we had left them at our actual campsite 3 kilometers upstream. But this duplicate campsite showed signs of extended use and deteriorating conditions. The tent was partially collapsed, the equipment was scattered and damaged, and there were obvious signs of a struggle or emergency situation that had left the area in disarray. The most disturbing discovery was finding what appeared to be our own bodies in the collapsed tent, both showing signs of hypothermia and exposure that suggested we had died after several days of unsuccessful survival attempts. The bodies were definitely Carl and myself, same clothing, same physical characteristics, same personal items and identification, but in a state of decomposition that indicated death had occurred several days earlier, which was obviously impossible since we were both alive and examining the scene. Carl found a journal near the bodies that was written in his own handwriting, documenting our hunting trip but with events and timeline that diverged significantly from our actual experience. According to the journal, we had encountered severe weather on our second day, suffered equipment failures that left us stranded without adequate shelter or communication capabilities, and spent several days attempting to signal for rescue before succumbing to exposure and hypothermia on what the journal indicated was our 6th day in the wilderness. The journal entries described making repeated emergency radio calls from coordinates that matched the island location, which explained the distress transmissions we'd been hearing at our actual campsite. But the dates in the journal were 3 days ahead of our current date, suggesting that we were somehow observing the aftermath of events that hadn't happened yet, or that we had discovered evidence of our own future deaths in a timeline that we hadn't experienced. We spent several hours documenting the scene with photographs and GPS readings, but when we attempted to examine the bodies more closely or collect the journal and other evidence, everything on the island seemed to become less substantial and more difficult to interact with directly. The tent, the equipment, and the bodies maintained their visual appearance, but felt increasingly insubstantial to physical contact, as if we were observing a projection or hologram rather than actual physical objects. The return trip to our actual campsite was accomplished without incident, but when we arrived, We found that our emergency radio was broadcasting distress calls in our own voices, transmitting from the coordinates of the island where we had discovered our future corpses. The radio was definitely transmitting these messages automatically. But neither Carl nor I had programmed it to broadcast. And we couldn't figure out how to stop the transmissions despite our familiarity with the equipment. We packed up our campsite immediately and arranged for early extraction by our contracted bush pilot, citing equipment failures and personal emergencies that required our immediate return to civilization. During the flight back to Old Crow, our pilot mentioned receiving distress calls on emergency frequencies from our hunting area. But when we asked for details, he described transmissions that matched what we had heard at our campsite rather than any calls we had actually made. Carl and I never discussed the island discovery in detail after returning home, but we both independently researched temporal anomalies, parallel timelines, and similar phenomena reported by other people who spend extended time in isolated wilderness areas. We found scattered reports of hunters, trappers, and researchers encountering evidence of their own presence in locations they had never visited, but nothing that provided a satisfactory explanation for our experience. We haven't returned to the Porcupine River area for hunting trips since 2019, partly because we're both concerned about encountering the same temporal anomaly again, and partly because we're not certain whether we actually survived our encounter with our future selves or whether we're currently existing in some kind of alternative timeline where our deaths were prevented by observing their possibility in advance. The Gwich'in elder warned us that something was hunting in the forests around Fort McPherson, something that used to be human, but had crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. When we found the first set of tracks, human feet but stretched impossibly long, with claw marks where toes should be, we realized we weren't tracking an animal. Have you ever followed tracks that started looking human but gradually became something else entirely? Tell me in the comments about the most disturbing thing you've ever found while tracking in the wilderness. Because what we discovered in those northern forests challenged everything I thought I knew about the boundaries between human and monster. My name is Robert Alexi, and I work as a search and rescue coordinator for the RCMP detachment in Fort McPherson, Northwest Territories. I'm also Gwich'in, born and raised in this region, so I understand both the official protocols for wilderness emergencies and the traditional knowledge that my grandmother and the other elders have shared about things that exist in our territory but don't appear in government manuals or training courses. When people go missing in the boreal forests and tundra around Fort McPherson, I'm usually the first person called to organize search operations. And over 15 years in this position, I've seen cases that pushed the boundaries of rational explanation. The incident I'm about to describe took place in November 2021. During the early winter period, when temperatures hover around 20 degrees Celsius, and snow cover is deep enough to preserve clear tracks, but the ground isn't frozen solid enough to prevent certain predators from digging or burrowing. A family of 4 from Edmonton had been overdue from a camping trip in the Richardson Mountains, and their emergency beacon had stopped transmitting from coordinates about 40 kilometers northeast of Fort McPherson. In an area where traditional hunting camps had been abandoned for several generations due to what the elders diplomatically referred to as spiritual disturbances, I assembled a search team that included 2 RCMP constables, a territorial emergency services specialist, and my uncle Joseph Alexi, who serves as our cultural liaison and traditional knowledge advisor for operations that take us into areas where indigenous protocols might be relevant. Joseph is in his 70s, fluent in Gwich'in, and has spent his entire life traveling through this territory as a hunter, trapper, and guide. So his expertise in reading signs and understanding unusual situations in the wilderness is invaluable for complex search operations. The missing family's last known campsite was located without difficulty, But the scene we found there was disturbing in ways that didn't fit standard patterns for wildlife encounters, equipment failures, or typical survival emergencies. The tent had been shredded from the outside by what appeared to be claws, but the damage patterns were too systematic and deliberate to have been caused by a bear or other large predator defending territory or seeking food. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the area, but in arrangements that suggested conscious placement rather than random destruction. And several items showed bite marks that were consistent with human dental patterns, but far too large to have been made by normal human jaws. Joseph examined the scene using traditional tracking methods, while the rest of our team documented evidence using standard forensic procedures, and his assessment was immediately concerning. According to his reading of the signs, the family had been approached by something that walked upright like a human, but left tracks that were significantly larger and showed anatomical features that didn't match normal human foot structure. The tracks showed elongated digits with what appeared to be claw marks, and the stride length suggested a creature that was taller and had longer legs than any human could possess. The trail leading away from the campsite was clear enough to follow, despite the recent snowfall, and it led northeast toward areas that Joseph said had been avoided by local hunters for over 50 years due to persistent reports of encounters with something that the Gwich'in language describes as a human who has abandoned their humanity through cannibalism or other violations of natural law. Joseph explained that traditional knowledge recognizes the possibility of human transformation into something predatory and inhuman, but that such creatures are extremely dangerous and should not be approached without proper spiritual preparation and protection. We followed the tracks for approximately 8 kilometers through increasingly dense forest, with the trail showing evidence that the creature was carrying or dragging heavy objects that were probably the missing family members. The physical evidence suggested that whatever we were tracking possessed strength far beyond human capabilities, because the drag marks indicated that it was transporting multiple adult bodies simultaneously across terrain that would challenge a single person carrying minimal equipment. The tracks led to a natural depression in the forest floor that had been modified into what appeared to be a den or lair, with excavated areas that showed signs of long-term habitation and food storage. The site contained human remains from multiple individuals, some showing signs of recent death, and others that appeared to have been there for months or years. The arrangement of the remains suggested systematic consumption rather than random predation, with specific body parts separated and cached in different locations throughout the site. Joseph's assessment of the scene was that we were dealing with a Wendigo, which traditional Gwich'in knowledge describes as a human being who has been transformed through cannibalism into a creature with insatiable hunger for human flesh and supernatural strength and endurance. According to traditional protocols, encountering a Wendigo requires specific spiritual responses and protection that aren't part of standard search and rescue procedures. And Joseph strongly advised that we withdraw immediately and seek guidance from appropriate traditional authorities before attempting any rescue or recovery operations. The Territorial Emergency Services Specialist wanted to establish a perimeter and call for additional law enforcement support. But before we could implement standard containment procedures, we heard sounds from deeper in the forest that suggested the creature was returning to its den. The sounds were human-like vocalizations, but distorted in ways that made them difficult to interpret, somewhere between screaming and howling, with a quality that seemed designed to cause fear and disorientation in anyone who heard them. Joseph led our retreat from the area using traditional methods that involved specific routes and behaviors designed to avoid attracting the attention of supernatural predators. And we managed to return to Fort McPherson without direct confrontation with whatever was inhabiting the forest den. The official report classified the incident as a wildlife attack with unknown predator species, and the site was designated as hazardous terrain that would require specialized equipment and personnel for any future operations. The follow-up investigation was handled by territorial wildlife officials and RCMP Major Crimes Division. But their approaches focused on identifying large predator species or human perpetrators rather than addressing the spiritual and cultural aspects that Joseph considered essential for understanding and resolving the situation. The den site was eventually sealed and marked as contaminated terrain. But no arrests were made, and no definitive identification of the predator was established through conventional investigation methods. Joseph arranged for traditional Gwich'in spiritual authorities to perform appropriate ceremonies for protecting the community and addressing the spiritual imbalance that allows Wendigo transformations to occur. But these activities weren't documented in official reports and weren't coordinated with territorial or federal law enforcement agencies. The effectiveness of traditional responses to supernatural threats isn't measured using the same criteria that apply to conventional law enforcement outcomes. So there's no official assessment of whether the spiritual interventions successfully resolved the situation. I've continued working search and rescue operations in the Fort McPherson area. But I now coordinate with Joseph and other traditional knowledge keepers before entering areas where unusual disappearances or predator encounters have been reported. The integration of traditional and contemporary approaches to wilderness emergency response has proven more effective than relying solely on standard protocols, particularly in cases where the circumstances don't fit conventional categories of wildlife behavior or human criminal activity. The families of the missing Edmonton campers were provided with official notification that their relatives had been killed in a wildlife attack. But they weren't given details about the specific nature of the predator or the condition of the remains that were recovered from the forest den. The decision to limit information disclosure was made jointly by territorial authorities and traditional leaders, based on assessments that complete transparency about supernatural threats might cause public panic or inappropriate responses that could endanger additional people. I still patrol the Richardson Mountains region as part of my search and rescue duties, but I maintain different protocols for areas where Wendigo encounters have been reported. And I always travel with traditional spiritual protection and knowledge support when operating in territories where the boundary between human and inhuman predators has been compromised. The official records don't acknowledge the supernatural aspects of cases like this. But the practical reality of wilderness work in northern Canada requires recognition that some threats exist outside the categories that conventional training and equipment are designed to address. The Wendigo that killed the Edmonton family is probably still active in the forests around Fort McPherson. But traditional knowledge suggests that appropriate spiritual responses can contain such creatures and prevent them from expanding their hunting territory or transforming additional humans through direct contact or spiritual contamination. Whether these traditional containment methods are effective long-term solutions, or whether more direct intervention will eventually become necessary, remains to be determined through ongoing monitoring and collaboration between conventional authorities and Indigenous knowledge keepers who understand the true nature of the threats that exist in our northern wilderness areas. The weather station at Comacuck Beach had been broadcasting automated readings for 30 years without human intervention. So when we received a personal message in Morse code asking for help, we knew something was impossibly wrong. The coordinates in the transmission led us to our own location, and the timestamp was dated exactly 24 hours in the future. Have you ever received a message from yourself that you never sent? Warning about events that haven't happened yet? Tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced communication from the future. Because what happened at Canada's northernmost point still makes me question whether time moves in the direction we think it does. Dr. Elena Vasquez, atmospheric physicist, University of Alberta. Research expedition to Comacuck Beach, Yukon Territory, July 2023. Northernmost point of mainland Canada. Coordinates 69-6xN, 140 to 59.9W. Our team was conducting climate monitoring research at the abandoned DW Line station, part of a comprehensive study documenting permafrost degradation and atmospheric changes in the high Arctic. The location represents one of the most isolated research environments in North America. Over 400 kilometers from the nearest community, accessible only by helicopter or specialized Arctic vehicle during brief summer weather windows. Comacook Beach Weather Station ceased human operations in 1993, but continued automated atmospheric data transmission via satellite uplink, powered by solar panels and backup generators. Our research team included myself, Dr. Marcus Chen from Environment Canada, graduate student Sarah Kim, and helicopter pilot James McLeod, who would remain on site for our planned 5-day data collection period. Standard protocol for Arctic research stations requires continuous monitoring of automated systems, emergency communication capabilities, and strict adherence to safety procedures designed to prevent personnel from becoming stranded in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Initial equipment checks confirmed all systems functioning normally. Weather station transmitted standard meteorological data every 6 hours as programmed. Solar power systems operating at 85% capacity. Emergency communication equipment tested successfully with base station in Inuvik. Research instruments deployed according to specifications. No anomalies detected during first 48 hours of operation. Team morale excellent. Weather conditions favorable. Research objectives proceeding on schedule. Day 3, 14:30 hours. Routine monitoring of weather station transmissions detected non-standard signal on emergency frequency. Signal consisted of Morse code pattern, not consistent with automated weather data format. Initial interpretation suggested equipment malfunction or interference from military communication satellites. Dr. Chen attempted signal isolation using spectrum analyzer. Results indicated transmission originating from local weather station equipment rather than external source. Morse code translation. Elena Vasquez team, Comacook Beach, urgent assistance, required evacuation, impossible coordinates. 69-36 NN 140 degrees 59.WW time critical. Coordinates matched our exact location. Timestamp embedded in transmission indicated message sent 24 hours future from current time. No personnel authorized to transmit personal messages using weather station equipment. Dr. Chen verified all team members present and accounted for. No other human presence detected within 400-kilometer radius, according to helicopter reconnaissance. Message repeated every 15 minutes with identical content and timestamp progression, maintaining 24-hour advance of current time. Signal strength consistent with local transmission source. Technical analysis confirmed message originating from weather station's primary communication array, despite absence of manual operator. Sarah Kim documented all transmissions using digital recording equipment. Pattern analysis revealed no random elements, messages mathematically precise, suggesting artificial generation rather than human composition. 15:45 hours. Second transmission received with expanded content. Dr. Chen atmospheric readings. Critical levels Sarah Kim equipment failure. Cascade event James McLeod, helicopter, inoperative stranded coordination required. Transmission referenced specific team member names and operational details, not programmed into weather station database. Future timestamp maintained exact 24-hour differential. Dr. Chen attempted response transmission, but received no acknowledgement, despite message repetition continuing on schedule. 16 hours. Third transmission. Permafrost degradation. Accelerated beyond projections, ground instability. Compromising station, structural integrity, Evacuation protocols initiated. Ground conditions around weather station appeared normal. Permafrost measurements showed expected seasonal variation without anomalous readings. Structural integrity assessment revealed no immediate concerns. However, future timestamps suggested these conditions would develop over following 24-hour period. Team discussion regarding appropriate response to anomalous transmissions. Dr. Chen recommended immediate evacuation based on precautionary principle. James McLeod confirmed helicopter operational readiness, but noted weather conditions deteriorating according to satellite meteorology. Sarah Kim advocated continuing research mission while monitoring situation development. Personal assessment. Transmissions potentially indicating equipment predictive malfunction or unknown environmental threat requiring investigation. 17:30 hours. Fourth transmission introduced additional complexity. Temporal displacement effect documented causality loop established evacuation. Attempts unsuccessful message transmission, only viable communication method. Content implied transmission source possessed knowledge of our reception and discussion of previous messages. Temporal displacement reference suggested sender experiencing time differential relative to our current time frame. James McLeod attempted helicopter departure for emergency consultation with base station Inuvik. Engine failure during startup sequence. Diagnostic evaluation revealed multiple system malfunctions affecting flight control, navigation, and communication systems. Failures appeared simultaneous and comprehensive rather than cascading from single-point source. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly with visibility dropping to less than 100 meters due to unexpected fog formation. 18 hours. Fifth transmission. Helicopter mechanical failure confirmed fog conditions, preventing visibility. Ground instability, beginning northeast section station. Timeline acceleration observed. Transmission accurately described current conditions, despite timestamp indicating 24-hour future origin. Sarah Kim's equipment registered unusual electromagnetic readings consistent with temporal distortion phenomena reported in theoretical physics literature. Ground stability monitoring detected subsidence beginning northeast weather station exactly as predicted by transmission. Rate of permafrost degradation exceeded normal seasonal patterns by factor of approximately 50. Infrastructure damage becoming apparent in sections of station not previously showing deterioration signs. Team relocated to southwest section of facility for structural safety. 24 hours. Extended transmission received. Temporal loop mechanics, partially understood, past team receiving, future team transmissions, evacuation. Impossible due to causality requirements, survival, dependent on message relay accuracy. Implication. Our current situation predetermined by necessity of transmitting future warnings to previous timeline iteration. Paradox of requiring our survival to send messages that ensured our survival. Night shift monitoring revealed progressive deterioration, matching transmission predictions. Ground instability expanded throughout station area. Helicopter remained inoperative despite Dr. Chen's mechanical expertise. Weather conditions prohibited ground evacuation attempts. Emergency supplies sufficient for extended stay, but long-term survival prospects declining, according to transmission timeline. Day 4. Transmission content evolved to include specific survival instructions. Solar panel array Section C requires manual realignment backup, generator fuel line inspection, necessary water purification system, component replacement, priority. Instructions proved accurate for maintaining life support systems as infrastructure degradation continued. Final transmission series began Day 5, 06 hours. Message relay sequence completion required ensure. Past team survival, Temporal stability, dependent on transmission, continuation. Future team acknowledges sacrifice necessary for causality preservation. Understanding achieved. We had become the future team, sending warnings to our past selves to ensure survival necessary for sending warnings. Evacuation achieved day 6 through implementation of survival strategies provided by future transmissions. James McLeod restored helicopter functionality using repair sequence received via Morse code from future timeline. Weather cleared according to predicted schedule. Team extracted successfully with complete research data and documentation of temporal communication phenomenon. Post-incident analysis. Weather station transmissions ceased immediately following our departure. No subsequent anomalous signals detected. Official reports classified incident as equipment malfunction, with remarkable coincidental accuracy of predictive failures. Research data confirmed significant permafrost degradation and atmospheric anomalies, but no reference to temporal displacement effects. Personal assessment. Experienced genuine communication with future timeline version of research team. Trapped in causality loop requiring message transmission to ensure past survival, necessary for future message transmission capability. Paradox resolved through successful execution of predetermined survival sequence. Temporal mechanics remain beyond current scientific understanding, but practical applications demonstrated effective. If you've made it this far through these 11 disturbing accounts from Canada's most remote territory, you've experienced just a glimpse of the inexplicable events that occur when humans venture into places where the normal rules don't seem to apply. The Yukon Territory holds secrets that challenge our understanding of reality, time, and what's possible in our world. These stories represent only the beginning of what's waiting to be discovered in the frozen wilderness, where civilization ends and something else begins. Make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more terrifying true accounts that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around us. Hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what we've uncovered next. And trust me, some stories are too disturbing to hear alone.